Greetings, dear ones. Where's your mind at right now? Well, I'm going to tell you where mine started this morning when I woke up and I decided I was going to be different today. And so I wandered off into my day thinking, well, there's not much I can do about what's going on outside of myself, outside of my space. So what can I do? So I decided to part my hair on the other side. Now that may not seem very significant, but it is an indication to my subconscious mind that I'm choosing to be in the world in a different way. And that doesn't mean good or bad. It just means making some different choices until I find the ones that are really working for me. And so I went to bed last night in a state of real disappointment that a cultural hero of mine, somebody who has been doing a lot in education and entertainment for years that I very much appreciated, fell so far from the pedestal that I'd put that person on yesterday when I discovered them doing an interview with somebody who likes to use the term libtard on a regular basis about how stay in place orders and the various different mechanisms that are being put in place to help us to flatten the curve, all of the things you've heard about how we can keep ourselves safe and get out of this pandemic with any sense of safety, that those things are treating us like children. Now, this person is my age, so super not a child. And I thought to myself, are you kidding me? This notion of being asked to do something that is uncomfortable for you for the greater good, for one thing, and for your own safety is somehow treating you like a child. Well, I will tell you what is childlike, and that is railing against something that is for your benefit with the, you can't make me. This is a free country. I can do whatever I want. Now, it is true that it's a free country, but that doesn't mean you can do anything you want. And morally, it definitely does not mean that you can put yourself and others at risk simply because you're bored. Now, I get the economic differences in our society, and the government definitely needs to be doing more on that level to keep small businesses safe, to keep individuals who are being required to go back to work for reasons that are speculative. Like, we're going to open up the economy and everything is going to go back to normal. Well, I can tell you right now that isn't exactly what's going to happen, because people can open their businesses. Doesn't mean that customers are going to show up. People who are fearful of being out in the world in unprotected ways are not, I hope, going to be showing up to these venues and automatically things going back to the way they were before. I don't know that we'll ever go back to exactly the way we were before, and I don't view that as necessarily even a bad thing. We have to find a new way forward. How is this country going to part its hair differently so that we can be taking care of ourselves in a compassionate and thoughtful way? And it sort of reminds me of back in the day with the Burger King commercials. You can have it your way right now, any way you want. That isn't what it means to be in a society. That's what it means to be childlike and assume that no matter how you behave in the world, you ought to be rewarded for it. It's mind-boggling. So I'm asking those of us who are not interested in putting other people at risk to think about what we can do now with strategic optimism. Meaning, of course, we're going to find a solution. We're humanity. We always do. Are we going to love every aspect of those solutions? I don't know. Most of them probably will be fine. Some of them are going to suck really hard. And that's something that we as individuals need to look at our own feeling states to determine how to manage them. And one of the ways I'd like for you to think about this a little bit differently is, do not time limit your okay-ness. When we say, I'm going to feel so much better when I can hug my family. Of course that's true. And that's something that I do want for people, but you shouldn't time limit your ability to be okay in any given moment. I'll be okay when this happens. And if it doesn't happen, I'm going to lose my... Okay, you're telling yourself a predictive story. You're saying everything will be okay when, and that's a very childlike impulse, which is understandable, but can be terribly, terribly destructive. You have the opportunity to decide that you're okay right now, because unless you're actually on fire, as I tell my clients all the time, meaning en flambe, in this given moment, you're probably okay. And by the way, in that fight or flight, resistance to all things around you mindset, you chemically are not able to be creative. You can't come up with the solutions that might be helpful to you. When we look into the abyss of, the things that we can't control, or the things that we don't even recognize that we have the opportunity to control, we assume that there is no solution. It's just going to be the worst. Again, I refer you back to humanity in general. We've overcome everything that's been thrown at us so far. We will overcome this. I want you to come out of it happier and more in control of your emotional state. Because when you are, then you have the ability to be creative. Then you can be innovative. Then you can think about the good of those around you rather than focusing singularly on your own discomfort. Which leads me to the next point, which is so important. There is a huge difference between discomfort and disaster. Let me say that again. There's a huge difference between discomfort, I don't like this, and disaster, this is going to kill me. Huge difference. But we're not trained to recognize even the middle point in those two scales anymore. With all of the advertising that we get, the messages from the media, things that we teach each other because we learn from somebody else, we have the sense that there's no space between 0 and 1,000 when it comes to our discomfort and our unwillingness or inability to manage either the unknown or those things that we don't enjoy. And I don't know about you, but I can look back at my background, which was legitimately hell. I mean, I came from an environment that at this point in human history, I am so grateful for, because I learned how to cope, not in the, I'm going to manage this so much better. It's just, okay, my perspective is such that, yeah, this may suck hugely, but I can handle it. I know I can, because I've handled worse, to be perfectly frank. And a lot of you have too. A lot of people have been through so much, but then they get the story of, well, I shouldn't have to suffer anymore. And I'm not going to dispute that. It's not for anybody outside of yourself to determine that, except that what I would submit to you is that we cause more suffering by focusing on everything as suffering. Okay, so how do you manage loneliness, boredom, the fear of the unknown? How can you get a grip on those feelings? Well, the first thing you need to do, or you can do if you choose, is to recognize how it feels in your body. And it turns out that the chemical experience of fear and excitement are exactly the same. The sort of hormonal experience, the physiological manifestations are the same. The difference is the story we tell ourselves about whether this is dangerous, whether this is for us or not for us. Do I want it or do I not want it? And so I would ask you to imagine, what would it be like to be a person who can manage these feelings? And by the way, reminding yourself that your feelings are visitors, they're not residents in your mind. You can really only manage a certain emotional experience for a limited amount of time, and then you start applying a lot of thoughts to it. There's a difference between thoughts and feelings. And so I would recommend that you consider taking on the wisdom that has been shared with us by role models who know better than we do about how to manage these periods in our lives. I refer you to Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book that I ask everyone to read the first 100 pages of, Man's Search for Meaning. Significantly changed my life and put in perspective my ability to manage in difficult times. Then there's Nelson Mandela, who talks about, how he managed his 27 years in prison. And as a lot of people know about me, one of the quirky things about my past is that I studied extensively when I was an undergraduate Soviet dissident literature. There's a long reason for why that is, but it exposed me to the memoirs of people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, by the way, despite being a brilliant I don't know, maybe because of being a brilliant mathematician, he was the most curmudgeon ever to curmudge. And rightly so. He spent the vast majority of his adult life in prison until for being a dissident, just asking for fair practices for laborers. And then he got the gift of moving to America, and frankly, he hated it here. He would much rather have been continuing the fight in Russia. But the other, I recommend all of the dissident literature because there's so much wisdom and personal responsibility and just mindfulness within those memoirs. But my personal favorite was written by a man named Vladimir Bukovsky, and it was called "To Build a Castle, My Life as a Dissenter." And Bukovsky spent the better part of 30 years in prison, and one of the things in isolation as well, and one of the things that really helped him was to create a castle in his mind, to add rooms to it. No matter how cold and wet and hungry and downtrodden he was in those circumstances, he would shift from the disaster perspective, which in that moment, I guess we could all agree was super true, to the, okay, this is uncomfortable, but I can imagine my life and the world being different. I was so moved by not only that metaphor, but his steadfast dedication to it. And so what the world learned, and in 1978 when that book was published, it was hugely popular. That's how it came to my attention initially. And one of the people who spoke about it said that, no matter what's going on around you, a revolt of the mind is possible, meaning you have the option to choose how you're going to think and feel about what's going on around you. And so I would ask you to think about the mindsets that will sustain you through any sort of difficulty, much less the one we're in right now, and which of them you've learned that drag you down, that steal your energy, the worry that keeps you busy doing nothing, the sensation that other people are making your life hard. You get to rewrite those stories, and I would love to help you to do that, but what I would really ask is that you look for those role models, whether they're real people or fictional characters who manage their circumstance in a way where they're having it and observing it at the same time and making decisions about how they're going to think and feel about it. And lastly, I want you to consider, now I love words. I love having a good vocabulary. I love that, there are 15,000 feeling words in the English language, and it makes me so sad that we use like 4 of them, hangry, 5 of them, angry, amazed, fine, and, meh. When there's so many other gradations of emotion, and when you understand that a little bit more on a more granular level, you have greater control over your emotions because you can identify them, make decisions about them. So I know that the worst thing you can say to somebody who's upset is just calm down. Goodness knows that's never worked on me. But look at patience versus acceptance. Like, when we hear the term patience, and I resist using it most of the time because it's so triggering for people. Don't tell me not to feel the way I feel. I'm not saying that at all. I'm asking you to actually notice how you really feel and think about the stories that are attached to that concept and how you might get that need met in a different way. Because if it hasn't changed up until now, it's not going to until you apply a process to change your own mind about it. And the good news is, whatever you've changed your mind about at any point in life means that you can change your mind about something else. And when you change your language, you change your life. So patience versus acceptance. And again, acceptance gets a bad rap too, because it sounds like we're giving up, like we're throwing in the towel, or we're letting other people off the hook. And that's not what we're talking about, not what I'm talking about, which is the rational assessment. It's like an inventory of what's actually happening in front of me. Not telling yourself that nothing is going on, but to look at it and say, okay, well, what really is happening here? And how do I want to think about it? Because when you recognize that if you are gritting your teeth and just going along with something, that's not patience. And if you're like, whatever, that's not acceptance either. And the only way you can come to a useful, as far as I'm concerned, a strategic use of the concepts of patience and acceptance of the circumstances that we're in right now is to become present, to come into the present moment, not telling yourself stories about, we're being treated like children and how dare they take things away from us, etc. Or, it's always been this way or it'll never be that way. To come into the present moment and say, okay, this is how I felt up until now. Is that working for me? And sometimes it is. Being angry, frustrated, all of these things have value, but they aren't always coming from a genuine place. Sometimes we get into those states of mind simply because we don't have any better ideas. And very often, and this is what made me so mad about this hero of mine, very often we take guidance from other people who don't actually have our best interests at heart. Let's all rally together and say, you can't do this to us anymore. We're going to open up our economy so that minimum wage workers have no choice. They've got to go back to work, because if they don't, they'll get fired. And by the way, they don't qualify for unemployment if that's the case. There's a huge financial construct that is connected to opening the system earlier rather than later, which please don't hear me arguing against that. I just want it to be done safely so that those people who have to go out and take care of the things we say we want are not being sacrificial lambs. That I don't need to be able to go sit in a restaurant so that a server can put themselves at risk for me. I know that there are alternatives, and I know that we as a society could support those of us who don't have the luxury of working from home in safer and more constructive ways that are going to benefit us all. So that's my social rant of the moment, but that's an illustration to what I hope you can take from this, which is boredom is not a disaster. Loneliness is not a disaster. We have so many different ways to reach out with each other now that a lot of us never had access to before. I thank goodness that I've been working as a therapist and a life coach remotely for about 18 years, way back before people thought it was useful to work on the phone. That's where I started. I'm so grateful that this was an easy transition for me. So if there's something, I would love to hear comments, and pushing back is good too, but I'd love to hear what are one or two things that you could say to yourself, okay, I'm so uncomfortable right now. I'm so uncomfortable. And if I'm going to take an inventory of what's around me, I'm grateful that fill in the blank, whatever it is. And with that, then I choose to do blank, right? Like I'm not a big cook. I can cook. I'm not a terrible cook, but it's not something that gives me as much joy as I'm so joyful seeing other people get into these days. But I'm willing to do it for a whole lot of reasons, not least of which to have a project that I can complete on these days that seem to get longer and weirder because we don't have good boundaries anymore. But I'd be so interested to hear, what is something that when you're in distress, you can look around you and be grateful for, which ups your energetic ability to think more clearly? And then what is something that you want to put in place to make your experience different? For me, it started with parting my hair on the opposite side. And I get that seems silly, but it's something over which I have power, I have control. And I'd like you to choose something for yourself as well. And so please As you move forward through your day and the days to come, focus on what you want rather than what you don't want. You're going to be so much more likely to get more of the former and less of the latter. That's just math. Take good care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Think creatively about how you can feel differently in any given moment, and we will all get through this together.